Welcome back to the TMDSAS podcast. I'm your host, Enrique Hasso, the coordinator of research, advising services, and digital media at the TMDSAS office in Austin, Texas. I'm very, very fortunate today to have been able to steal away two of TMDSAS's most difficult people to track.
Oh, that's probably more like it.
Yeah, most difficult people to track. We have June Atley, our Application Residency Specialist, and we have Matthew Meeks, the Director of TMDSAS. Welcome to the TMDSAS podcast.
Great to be here.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Would you all mind giving our listeners just a quick introduction to who you are and what you do here at TMDSAS?
Sure. My name is June Atley, and I just recently joined TMDSAS this past March.
Welcome.
Thanks. It's been great.
She started right at the busy season. So.
Yes, I did.
Trial by fire.
I came from UT Austin, so I was a residency counselor at UT Austin, and I also worked in international admissions as well. But yeah, the majority of the year I was advising on how to establish residency for tuition purposes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that pretty much makes you our resident expert on residency here.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, we'll test you later.
Okay.
And Mr. Meeks has already been on the podcast, so we'll just give you a quick intro into what you're working on right now.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of projects that we're working on. Namely, we're getting the apps out to schools. The app cycle opened a couple weeks ago, and we've received more applications up to this point than we ever have before.
Yeah.
So it's been a busy season.
Oh yeah, already. And we're excited to see so many applicants getting started and submitting their applications early. As we heard earlier, applying early for TMDSAS is something that's extremely important. So if you haven't checked that out, check out our earlier podcast on applying early to TMDSAS and why that matters in the grand scheme of the application. All right, so for our residency podcast, we have several questions that we wanted to ask you all, and we'll also be running through some residency scenarios to make sure that June knows she knows her stuff. But first off, let's talk about how residency is determined.
Yeah. So when the student is initially filling out their application, when they complete the residency section, specifically the proof of residency section, the system will generate an initial determination that they'll see. And so after the student submits the application, then we go in and actually review their proof of residency section and base our determination based off of that information that they've provided. So that initial determination made by the system isn't a final determination. So it's really important that students understand that we do actually review their residency information, and not to be alarmed if they may see like a non-resident determination at first, that we will look at it after submission.
Okay, so for listeners who aren't necessarily applicants yet, what kind of questions are asked in the residency section?
The residency section, the questions that are asked are questions that essentially are found within any kind of residency evaluation questionnaire for the state of Texas, for all Texas public schools. And so generally the residency questionnaire will ask first if they graduated from a Texas high school, if they lived in Texas for the 36 months prior to graduating from the high school. It'll also ask if they are currently enrolled at a Texas institution, if that institution has them coded as a Texas resident. And then it'll also ask if they are independent or claimed as a dependent by their parents for tax purposes.
Yeah.
In that way, the system will know who are we basing residency on. Are we basing on the student who's independent or on their parents who claim them? And then from there, questions of domicile are asked as far as how either the student or their parents have met residency by domicile. And from there, it pulls initial determination based off of that line of questioning.
Awesome. So it's not just random questions that TMDSAS came up with. These are like regulations that are passed down from the coordinating board and from the Texas legislature.
Correct, yes.
Well, that's good to know. So if an initial determination of residency is incorrect, what can an applicant do to appeal that?
If the system initially determines them, or do you mean like if we determine them?
If the system initially determines, say I fill out the application, it says I'm a non-resident, but clearly I am a resident because I've lived here my whole life. What can I do to make sure that you have all the paperwork you need to make sure to clarify that I am a resident?
Yeah, so when I go in and I review applicants' residency information, I do see, first off, how they're claiming residency. Based off how they are claiming residency, I can determine what documents I'll need for my evaluation. And so if I have any questions or if I do need any documents, I reach out to the student through the internal messaging system of the application to let them know. So it is like a thorough evaluation that takes place where I do communicate with the student if I need to, so that way I can get all the information to make a proper determination.
Great.
Yeah, and one thing to add to that is that, it's important for applicants to know that we review residency on 100% of all of our applications. So not just the ones where there's a disagreement between what the applicant is claiming and the actual initial determination. We review it for everybody.
Yes, that's correct.
Awesome. Well, we've thrown around some jargon on residency already. And I wanted to make sure that all of our listeners were on the same page with regards to some of the residency topics that we'll be talking about today. So if you don't mind, we run through a few definitions for our residency terms, and we'll start off with the kind of our slam dunk one is going to be Texas resident. What is a Texas resident?
So a Texas resident is someone whose primary residence and domicile is predominantly Texas. They can either go about meeting it through the high school graduation option where they're a Texas resident and they've been living in Texas and attending a Texas high school for at least that 36 months prior to graduating from it. Generally, that's where a lot of our Texas residents, how they meet residency if they're originally from here. Or another option is if it's by domicile. This would be referring to people coming from out of state who are living in Texas and they've established their domicile here for the 12 consecutive months. In our case, it would need to be 12 months prior to our application deadline, October 1st. And so generally, if they are meeting these requirements as far as showing that their intent is establishing their domicile here, then they would be coded as a Texas resident.
Yeah, and the important thing is intent. I mean, what we're looking at and what the kind of how the law is set up and stated is the applicant proving intent. And so it's not just that if you're from another state and you've come to Texas to study primarily, then we're going to assume that the intent is that you're not going to be a Texas resident. And so the law is set up to where the burden of proof is on the applicant.
I wanted to also throw in there are other scenarios for applicants to be considered a Texas resident. For example, we have exceptions for armed services, and there are, so many different exceptions. So if you have any concerns as to whether or not you are a Texas resident or not, we have a wealth of resources on our TMDSAS website under medical, dental, and veterinary applicant section. And there's a button specifically for residency so that everybody can go in and check out their own definitions. But moving on to our second one, a non-Texas resident. What is that?
So for a non-Texas resident, this would be someone who either has yet to meet the residency requirements to establish domicile here for the 12 months, or if Texas is not their primary residence. So in a lot of cases, we may have applicants or their parents where they own property here in Texas, but they consider another state as their primary residence as far as them living there, and they have driver's license and all their documentation established there. So when it comes to non-Texas residency, it's essentially if another state is that person's primary residence or if an applicant has yet to actually establish residency here for the 12 consecutive months.
So you're telling me I can't buy a 1 foot by 1 foot plot of land in the middle of nowhere, Texas, and claim Texas residency?
No, you can't.
Okay. That's
unfortunately,
good to know.
yeah.
That is good to know. Moving on to our third definition, residency for tuition purposes. We've already heard you drop this one. Would you mind giving us a quick definition for it?
Yeah. So when it comes to residency for tuition purposes, institutions of higher education will evaluate a student's residency for tuition purposes in the sense that it will determine if the student will be paying in-state or out-of-state tuition costs for that institution. It's important that the student understands that the requirements for residency is solely based on for whether or not they're going to pay in-state or out-of-state tuition. So a lot of cases we'll get students who feel like they meet residency when it comes to tax purposes, or things like that, but these requirements are solely just for tuition purposes, as well as for us here at the application as well.
Okay. And so if somebody has a scholarship for in-state tuition, that's different than TMDSAS making a determination whether you're a Texas resident or not a Texas resident.
Correct, because non-Texas residents can be able to pay in-state tuition due to that tuition waiver that they were granted from their school.
Yeah.
And so there are many different kinds of tuition waivers where it will allow the student to be eligible to pay in-state tuition, but they're still classified as a non-Texas resident. So it's important students know that distinction.
Great, thank you. And then we've definitely flaunted this one around a bit already. Establishing domicile in Texas. What does that mean?
So establishing domicile in Texas, generally we want to kind of see how the student is going about overcoming that initial presumption that they're not just here for school. So it's going to be more to it than just solely living in Texas for the 12 months, especially if they are a student here. We want to know what they've been doing while they've been living here. So usually examples of establishing domicile can either be if they're working, in which gainful employment would consist of working an average of at least 20 hours per week for the 12 consecutive months of non-student employment, or if they own residential property here in Texas, in which they're establishing their residence in that property that they own for the 12 months, or if they own and operate a business here in Texas. And then another option, if applicable, is if the student has a spouse and their spouse is a Texas resident, or if their spouse is establishing residency, they can base residency off their spouse. So they can go about establishing their domicile by any one of these 3 or 4 options while living here for the 12 months.
Right. And now we have a fun one. This is Residency Jeopardy. And I'll take Residency Jeopardy for 500, Matthew.
Yeah. Well, this can often be confusing to applicants, but Residency Jeopardy, because we use October 1st as our what we call census date, we're looking to see has an applicant established domicile by October 1, the application year. And if we determine that they have, we then try to determine whether or not they are in residency jeopardy. And I guess just kind of giving a scenario here, if an applicant has graduated from college and they're, say, in New York and they're doing research in a lab, and we see on the application in their chronology that they're going to be working in that lab over a 12-month period, then we're going to send them a residency jeopardy letter. And it's basically a letter that explains why they're in residency jeopardy and that they're going to need to do something to resolve that jeopardy in order to pay in-state tuition when they matriculate. So the residency jeopardy letter is not used for admission in the admissions process, but it's more for whether or not they're going to pay in or out-of-state tuition when they matriculate at a medical or dental or the vet school. So
Makes sense.
yeah.
And it's important to add that when we do send a residency jeopardy notification, that we're not saying that we're determining them as a non-resident. In the notification, we're actually telling them that we code you as a Texas resident. However, due to perhaps your absence, it's putting them on notice that when the schools evaluate their residency, the schools will be made aware of that when they evaluate them for tuition purposes later on if they're accepted. So a lot of applicants lately are under this impression that they're being determined as non-resident, when actually we're saying that we determine them as a resident for the application, but just be aware a second residency evaluation may occur due to this absence of yours. Yeah.
Okay, good to know. And finally, we've brought this up a couple of times, but we have employment that is temporary in nature.
Yes.
Take a stab at that one.
Temporary in nature. So I do come across a lot of students who do need further explanation for this particular phrase. Essentially, if they are employed in a position that's temporary in nature, usually for the most part there is an understanding between them and their employer that they're not meant to be at that establishment for too long. Usually a contract is generated to show that they're only there for a limited period of time, whether it's a year or 2 years. So the important thing is that applicants are aware that their employer is of that understanding that they're only with that position for a finite period of time, and that it's not a permanent position.
Makes sense. And so some examples of that might be like a work-study job.
Yeah, a work-study position, or if
Scribing position.
a scribing position. Sometimes internships are usually temporary.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, too, we see applicants trying to get research experience in a lab, and so they'll be working at a lab at a university, and generally those are considered temporary.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And there's also just certain programs that are just temporary in nature, where it's like, if it's the JET program in Japan, or if it's AmeriCorps or Peace Corps, programs such as those are usually temporary in nature, where the employer will indicate that as such.
Great. Thank you so much for clarifying all of these definitions. And we also have a link to many, many more definitions if you really want to become a residency expert. And those definitions are on our website under the residency section. And again, that's accessible via the medical, dental, or veterinary applicants pages. All right. So we said we were going to test Ms. June on several residency cases to make sure she is she earns the title of residency expert at TMDSAS. So we have 4 different cases here. Most of these are based on real life, so we know that these are applicable to many of our applicants. Are you ready, June?
Yes.
All right. First scenario. An applicant was born and raised in Mercedes, Texas, and her parents still live there. She graduated from Med High, the South Texas High School for Health Professions, and later attended Texas A&M Corpus Christi, where she is recognized as a Texas resident. Would she be considered a Texas resident for TMDSAS?
Yes, she would.
Awesome. So that's a slam dunk residency determination.
Yeah, I would definitely say so in so many ways and factors.
Great.
Yeah.
All right, 3-pointer then. All right. Well, our next residency case, this applicant is from Provo, Utah, and moved to Texas in the 3rd and 4th grade when he was in elementary school. But then he returned to Provo, where he stayed to attend BYU. Both of his parents have out-of-state addresses. Is he a Texas resident?
No, I would say he's a non-resident, mainly because we base residency off of current residency. So if him and his parents no longer reside in Texas, then he would be considered a non-resident at this time.
And if his grandparents still live in Texas?
No, residency is only based off either the student or the student's parents.
All right. Thought I'd throw that in. All right, our third case. This student grew up in Odessa, Texas. Graduated from Permian High School, clear eyes, full heart, can't lose. Went to college for 4 years at UC Berkeley, which is out of state, but his parents still claim him as a dependent on their taxes, and they still live in Odessa. Is he a Texas resident?
Yes. As long as he's claimed as a dependent by his parents for tax purposes, then his residency is always going to be based on whatever his parents' residency is, as long as they claim him. So if his parents are Texas residents, then he would qualify as a resident through them.
Okay. Well, you're answering these too quickly, so I'm going to throw you a few curveballs here with this one. So for our last case study, our last applicant grew up and graduated from high school in San Antonio. She attended and graduated from NYU in 2013. And has since taken on a permanent full-time position at a law firm. And she files her taxes independently from her parents, who still live in San Antonio. Is she a Texas resident?
I would say no.
Okay.
Because at first she might have still maintained her residency due to her temporary absence for school reasons. But the fact that she chose to continue living out of state instead of returning back to Texas after her studies. At that point, it's no longer temporary if she chooses to live out of state, and in this case, working full-time in a permanent position. So especially if she's no longer claimed as a dependent by her parents and she's independent, then at this time she would be considered a non-resident based off of her current residence.
Cool. Now, let's flip that one around. How does she become a Texas resident?
In this scenario, if she graduated from her out-of-state college and then say, if, for instance, if she took a position where that position was temporary in nature, so for instance, like an internship or shadowing a doctor as a scribe, in that scenario, she can still maintain her Texas residency because that position is temporary in nature, in which for an event like that, we would probably want to see documentation from the employer where they verify that this position is temporary. And so in that case, the applicant can still maintain their Texas residency because their absence is still considered temporary, but for a different reason.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Even if they've lived out of Texas for 5 years at this point?
Correct, because in the first instance, it was for educational purposes because they went to school out of state. And then in this next instance, it was due to a temporary job position. So the intent would be after she's completed this work out of state, she would be returning back to Texas.
Okay. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, obviously, we have a ton of applicants who have very unique scenarios. So if you ever have any question about what your status is as a Texas resident, please do check out our resource page for Texas Residency. We have several links to the coordinating board on regulations that are provided by the state, such as the law that states that 90% of positions at the medical schools, the dental schools and the vet school, must be filled by Texas residents. That's one of the reasons why we get so many questions about Texas residency. And if you're interested in finding those regulations, check out our resource page. And if you ever have any questions about residency, you can always send us an email at info@tmdsas.com. And we'll get to it as quickly as possible, considering we're in the middle of the application cycle. Any last questions before we let you all go back to processing?
Yeah. Well, the one thing I wanted to mention, and we see this quite often, I want to make sure applicants understand that if you were a Texas resident and you were claimed by your parents who are also Texas residents, and you move out of state to go to college or university, and then you become independent while at college or university, our system is going to make an initial non-residency determination, but we'll reverse that. So if you're if you are going to college out of state and you were a Texas resident, but you become independent while in college for whatever reason, again, our system's gonna determine you to be a non-resident. But once we review that case, we'll overturn that. That's fairly common.
Yeah,
so,
it is. It's pretty common.
Well, thank you for that clarification. And June, Matthew, thank you so much for joining us today.
All right.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Continue the conversation in our online communities on Facebook, the TMDSAS Hub, which is open to current and future applicants, and on the TMDSAS Non-Traditional Applicants group, where you can join others who are navigating through the process after graduating from college. On behalf of everyone here at TMDSAS, we wish everyone all the best of luck this application cycle. That's all we have for today's episode. We'll talk to you soon.